to an animal's body, they're going to bounce off. They're going to be reflected because the composition of the body is not the same as the composition of the surrounding fluid. So a sound wave in air would tend to bounce off the animal. You're not going to be able to use this kind of a system in order to detect sound. So, what the Anurans do, something like this. This being your inner ear. This is the outside world. And then we're going to have a tympanum. That thin line is the tympanum. So these very weak vibrations are coming through the air, and they're not hitting the massive body of the animal. Instead, they're hitting this very lightweight, very flexible membrane that has air on the outside and it has air on the inside. So that very thin, flexible membrane can move in and out with the vibrations of sound. If it were solid on the inside, it would not. It would reflect away. But because we have this very thin membrane, air on the inside, air on the outside, that membrane can vibrate along with the air molecules. Right? Sounds in air are relatively weak in terms of energy. By having a large tympanum, you collect that energy over a larger area. But then you need to focus it down and transmit it to your inner ear. And they're going to have a bone that will do that. And that bone is the stapes. I know you have a stapes inside you. It's the same one. It's just that mammals have two extra bones in the middle ear, as well as the stapes. Anybody know where the stapes came from? Evolutionarily speaking. So is it something that developed de novo, or is it a modification of something else?
Modification?
Of what?
One of the arches.
Diapsis versus synapsis, one of the poles.
No, that's not, that doesn't come in here.
Isn't it from one of the arches?
Yes.
I want to say the hyoid
Yes.
arch. Okay.
All right, we talked about the gill arches before, or the pharyngeal arches. All right, those arches from front to back in the animal, and we mentioned how the first arch turned into the jaws. The second arch has functions in fish. It's usually involved in helping to support the jaws. But once you come to amphibians, their jaws are firmly fused to the skull. And so they don't need any additional support from that second arch. So the second arch is out of a job, so to speak. And when you're out of a job, evolutionarily speaking, you tend to disappear or you get modified. You retool and learn a new skill. This is the new skill. So part of that second arch was adopted and became this middle ear bone, transmitting the vibrations from the tympanum to the inner ear. All right, so as it moves in and out, it causes the fluid in the inner ear to move, bending the hair cells, the neuromast cells, and that's perceived as sound. Now, salamanders, and I don't know anything about hearing in opodins, but salamanders, as we know, they don't communicate by sound. They don't have an external eardrum. They have very limited abilities to detect sound, and in actuality, so no tympanum, no stapes, in actuality, they detect sounds coming from the ground. So if you look at that diagram, they pick up vibrations through their front feet. Those vibrations are transmitted up the chain of bones to the scapula, And then there's a muscle that connects over to the inner ear. Those vibrations of the scapula pulling and releasing on that muscle set up movement of the water inside the inner ear. So they're not hearing sounds from the air. Most of those are simply just bouncing off the body of the animal. No tympanum, no stapes. They do hear very low frequency sounds that they can pick up through the vibration of their legs. So not much in the way of hearing ability in our salamanders. Okay. All right. Respiration. All right, so now we are a terrestrial animal. We have to obtain oxygen in order to maintain our existence. How do they go about doing it? Amphibians in general? Well, we do develop lungs, but we also have buccopharyngeal respiration and cutaneous respiration. So, yes, amphibians have lungs, but virtually no amphibian relies 100% on the lungs for their gas exchange. They're going to get varied amounts of it through two other sources. And those other sources are the buccopharyngeal and cutaneous. What's buccopharyngeal? Well, many of the amphibians have highly vascularized membranes in the mouth and throat area. Those membranes then can pick up additional oxygen. So we do get some gas exchange in that area of the animal as well as in the lungs. In addition, most are going to rely on cutaneous respiration to varying degrees. Now, to get oxygen diffusing into our bodies would be a very difficult thing because we have a very dry surface to our skin. It is not easy for something to diffuse from the air into a solid. Right? Exceedingly difficult to make it not practical. But amphibians, remember, are coating themselves with moist material most of the time. They're in wet areas. They have fluid all over their body. And it is quite possible then for oxygen to diffuse from the air into that moist layer on the outside of the frog and then into the bloodstream of the frog. So I throw up this particular table here just as an illustration of how much they are relying on other structures other than the lungs for respiration. This does not include the buccopharyngeal, but it does look at cutaneous versus pulmonary lungs for both oxygen and carbon dioxide. And just look at your anurans over here. So you've got Xenopus, then you got a toad, hey, the coquille from Puerto Rico, another toad, tree frog, and a ranid. And you can see that close to 40 to 50% of their oxygen is being obtained through their skin rather than through their lungs. And there's similar numbers for carbon dioxide. They're actually higher. Most of the carbon dioxide is being vented across the surface of the animal's body rather than through the lungs. So a very important feature of amphibians. They have to stay moist. They're going to dry out otherwise, but one reason why they're staying moist is so that they can have this additional diffusion of oxygen into their system across the body wall. Right. How do they breathe? How do they get the air into the lungs? Because we'll contrast that later on with the other groups. Well, it's a positive pressure buccal pump. So they will expand the mouth and throat area, drawing air in through the nostrils. They'll then close those nostrils and compress the mouth and throat area. With the nostrils closed, that forces that air under positive pressure back into the lungs. The lungs expand, and then exhalation is mostly passive, just passive recoil, sending it back out again. So we'll talk about it later, but you, for example, are bringing air into your lungs because of negative pressure. Amphibians are using positive pressure. Okay, integument. Skin of amphibians. Well, you have 2 layers to the skin. Did we cover that at all?
In
Anyway.
neurology, we covered it.
I know in mammalogy and comparative anatomy. The skin of any vertebrate, if you look at it, there's 2 main layers to it, if you will. There is an outer epidermis, epi means on top of, above, and a lower dermis. The epidermis typically is characterized by cells that are not necessarily all living. There's usually going to be some dead cells. Whereas the dermis, they're all going to be living. The dermis has a blood supply. The epidermis does not. One thing that starts in amphibians that was not present in fishes is that we're going to get some distinct layers in our epidermis. This outer layer that makes contact with the external world. So we had an epidermis in fish, but now we're going to get some distinct layers. And one that's important is the stratum corneum. So stratum in Latin just means layer. And corneum comes from the Latin word cornu, which means horn, like a cow's horn. So it's the horny layer. A cow's horn is made up of a particular protein called keratin. And that's the same thing that makes up your hair, makes up your nails, etc. All right? So a horny structure is something that is made up of the protein keratin by and large. Stratum corneum is on the outside. Right? So if we have a layer of cells here, 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 and here, then we're going to have a layer on the outside facing the outside world that is the stratum corneum. This would be the dermis down here. The cells of the stratum corneum are dead. They're not living. And they're filled with this protein keratin. So the formation of a stratum corneum, a keratinaceous layer on the outside of an animal, is a new structure in amphibians. And it does a couple of things. One, it is the outer surface of the animal, so when that animal makes a contact with a twig, a rock, or the ground, what's making contact is not living tissue. Instead, there's a layer of dead stuff to protect the living things underneath. So we get some physical protection by having a stratum corneum. But in addition, the keratin limits water loss to a certain degree. You're going to have less water loss if you have this layer of dead cells filled with keratin than if you did not. And we are a terrestrial animal now. We are moving out of the aquatic environment. Water loss is a problem. So you want to minimize the amount of water that is evaporating from your body and going elsewhere. Having this somewhat impermeable, it's not totally impermeable, but a less permeable layer on the outside will help you to live longer in this terrestrial environment. Yeah, that's good. That's a new development that comes into play. It gets very much more complex in the reptiles. ultimately turning into scales.